Well, the majority of mine workers in South Africa earn between 3 and 12,000 rand per month. 10 years ago, striking mine workers at Marikana were demanding 12,500 rand. They were earning about 6,000 rand at that time. So 10 years later, as we look back, workers at Sibanye-Stillwater fought tooth and nail for an increase of 1,000 rand. It does beg the question, of course, have mining houses learnt anything? Has anything changed since that tragedy 10 years ago? Let's bring in, as always, great to have guests like political analyst and political scientist, Dr. Guy Lamb from Stellenbosch University joining us. Dr. Lamb, good to have you back with us. So it's the obvious question, isn't it? It was the fight that was fought 10 years ago. The family still in limbo now. Some are saying not really much has changed. What do you have to say about what happened all those 10 years ago and what's really changed now?
Well, I mean, there have been some changes and some things have stayed the same. I think certainly from mine workers, the sort of circumstances they find themselves in, obviously there were some wage increases after the Marikana strike and after the Marikana Massacre, but I mean, those wages haven't necessarily kept pace with cost of living increases. I mean, I think some of the kind of questions we really need to be asking about what's been happening around public water policing, because, you know, there was the issue of kind of wages and striking, and that striking continues, but also around public water policing, there have been many challenges, but also some successes following on from that.
There's a lot of talk as well. It's not just about the money. And Tumza raised this very good point earlier between 6 and 7. It's not just about the money, is it? It's also about justice. Do you get a sense that justice has been served, not just by the country's courts, not just by compensation, but by those who were in power at the time? From a political perspective, has justice really been served?
Well, not really. I mean, we saw circumstances where we had the Farlam Commission of Inquiry, and that kind of provided us very good insight in terms of what had happened and who was responsible. We've seen those who were in decision-making positions, senior within the police, certainly the Northwest Police Commissioner, the Deputy Commissioner for the Northwest. We've seen the National Police Commissioner all losing their jobs. So there's been that kind of sense of there being consequences for them, but certainly for the families who lost loved ones, who had, kind of family members who were part of the strike, who weren't necessarily aggressive in this sort of situation, who were actually leaving the copy or subsequently were hunted down by the police and shot. There certainly hasn't been much justice for those families.
What would justice actually look like? It is now a decade later. It's obviously far too late to, I think, make up for all the damage that's been done, despite some money being paid to some of the families, I understand, according to some online reports. But I'm curious, Doctor, in your mind, what would justice look like if whoever would be politically responsible from government, etc., do something today? What would that look like?
I mean, that's a very difficult one, because, I mean, justice is open to interpretation, and justice is very much a personal thing. So certainly from families who, many living in the Eastern Cape, for example, what would that look like? Would that be a formal apology from government? Would it be some form of like scholarship that's put in place for children moving forward? But I think, there's some ultimate kind of justice around the perpetrators. So, for example, the perpetration of the violence that happened, especially around Copy 2, the second scene where you saw members of sort of the National Intervention Unit and the K9 unit within the police and other members of SAPS going in and looking pretty much to assassinate miners. And we know that from the Farlam Commission of Inquiry. And none of those individuals have been really held to account for it. So I think if we were looking at justice, we really need to look at, first and foremost, the main perpetrators of that. And then after that, we start looking at the enabling environment where there were decisions made by certain key officials within the police, either poor decisions or decisions that ultimately led to the violence that we should be seeing. If we wanted justice, they should be held accountable for that.
And when we talk about the unions that were involved at the time as well, 10 years ago, there were a lot of unions going backwards and forwards. AMCU, of course, was the main union at the time, so they claimed as well. But AMCU coming out in the last 12 hours, Doctor, saying that Marikana remains a no-go zone for Ramaphosa until he apologizes. Has that apology ever come, and should it come from the president?
Well, I mean, that's a difficult one to say. I mean, there's kind of been, there's been comments about it, but I think what ultimately it comes down to is, what those who reside in Marikana and who experienced the massacre and who lost loved ones as a result of it are probably looking for a personal apology from the president. And that certainly hasn't been forthcoming. But of course, if the president were to do it, it would expose him to a whole level of risks. So it's the sort of issue politically that's kind of been sort of just kept on the back burner and not being dealt with directly, unfortunately.
So when we spoke earlier, you mentioned some lessons learned by the mining company, Sibanye-Stillwater, in a case like this. I believe there were some houses built because that was one of the demands back all those years ago. What other lessons could they have learned from and have changed now, do you think? Do you think that the mine workers are better off now than they were 10 years ago? Or do you think those who died in vain?
Well, it's difficult to say. I mean, I don't have the data in front of me, but certainly you see many mine workers in those sort of areas still living in abject poverty, still living in circumstances which are not fit for kind of dignified living in many respects. I think mine companies have, made some changes following on from that. But it's more the sense of around, given the amount of money that's now being made out of the sort of mining sector in many respects, is the kind of standard of living that miners have to live by and the hard labor that they have to put in, surely they should be deserving of better pay and better living conditions.
Politically then, as a last question today, as a political scientist, who would you expect to see standing at the koppie addressing the community, the families who lost their loved ones? Who would you expect to be seeing today? Who should be standing up and talking?
Well, there should be multiple people that are there. I mean, number one, Minister of Mineral and Energy Affairs, because it's about mining. I think also the Minister of Police, because there's still, what happened there was who perpetrated the violence. So there was, the sort of build-up. You had tensions and violence happening between the different unions, between NUM and AMCU. But also you had the police still needs to answer questions. So I think the Minister of Police should be there too.
Oh, that's a very good point, Dr. Guy Lam. I appreciate your time in speaking to us, political scientist from Stellenbosch University. It was today, all those years ago, a decade ago exactly, that we saw what many are saying is a black spot on South Africa's democracy. We'll continue our focus on the Marikana Massacre throughout the morning here on eNCA.